Take the pretty one. Her uncle offered the Duke, but Gregory's gaze lingered on the broken daughter limping through the shadows. The Duke was supposed to choose her cousin. Instead, he turned his attention to her, the damaged one retreating into darkness. What did he see in the girl everyone else pitied that the world had overlooked? Welcome, my beautiful family, to today's story. I'm so grateful you're here with me. If you're new to our community or you've been here from the beginning, I want you to know how much your presence means. We're building something special together, a space where stories of resilience, love, and finding worth in a world that often overlooks us can flourish. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I truly need your support to make that happen. If this story touches your heart, if these characters speak to something within you, please hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not broken, just beautifully real. Every single subscriber helps us grow this family. And together we're proving that there's an audience for stories about people who bloom in darkness, who refuse to be invisible, who find love not despite their scars, but because of their authentic courage. Your support means everything. Let's build this community together. Now, let's get into the story. The winter afternoon light filtered through the conservatory windows in pale silver streams, illuminating the frost patterns etched across the glass like nature's own lacework. Margaret Elaine sat on the cold stone bench by the northern corner, her least favorite perch in all of Nicholas James's estate, but the only place where she could tend the dying roses without interruption. The shears were heavy in her hands, their metal cold despite the worn leather grip that had molded to her mother's palm years ago. She had just begun pruning the blackened stems, coaxing life from what others had abandoned, when the sound of carriage wheels on frozen gravel shattered the conservatory's brittle silence. He's arrived. The Duke has arrived. The parlor maid's breathless announcement echoed through the manor's marble halls, followed by the synchronized patter of servants' feet. Margaret looked up from her roses, the shears still poised mid-cut, and listened as the household erupted with an urgency it had never possessed for her sake. Doors slammed. Voices rose in practiced delight. Even Mrs. Brennan, their stern housekeeper, could be heard descending the grand staircase with militaristic precision. Margaret remained on her bench, watching the frost patterns catch the fading light, undisturbed by the performance beyond the conservatory doors. Her cousin had been preparing for this moment for months. New gowns commissioned, new accomplishments rehearsed, new ways to artfully toss her golden curls perfected. Margaret had heard it all discussed in exhaustive detail at every family meal, though no one had thought to ask if she might wish to be introduced as well. Not that it mattered. Margaret had long ago accepted her role in the household tableau, the afterthought to Seraphina's brilliance, the apology to her cousin's triumph. She returned her attention to the roses, but her hands trembled slightly. Through the conservatory's glass walls, she could see movement in the main hall, a flutter of expensive fabric, a flash of perfectly styled hair. Uncle Nicholas, you must see how the amber silk catches the light. Her cousin's voice rang clear and practiced, like crystal chiming. The dressmaker said it would compliment my complexion, and this necklace, Mother's emeralds, they make me look positively regal. You'll capture his attention within moments, my dear, Uncle Nicholas replied, his voice thick with satisfaction and desperation mingled. The Duke won't be able to look away. Margaret set down the shears quietly and stood, her right leg stiff from the cold and the old injury. She moved to the conservatory entrance that overlooked the manor's circular drive, careful to remain behind the heavy velvet curtain. Below, servants were arranging themselves in perfect formation, each polished and positioned to create the most impressive tableau. Uncle Nicholas stood at the center like a general commanding his troops, Seraphina beside him radiant in amber silk that caught every ray of available light. She was beautiful. There was no denying it. Society had proclaimed it since her debut 2 seasons ago, and the proclamation had only grown more fervent with time. Perfect features, Perfect posture, perfect breeding. Everything designed to catch a duke's eye and secure a duke's fortune. Margaret turned away from the window and caught her own reflection in the conservatory's glass wall. Dark auburn hair pulled back severely to hide its unmanageable curl. Hazel eyes that held too much knowledge for someone society preferred to overlook. Features that might have been striking if the limp hadn't taught her to make herself small. She was not ugly precisely, but she was not whole. And in the world they inhabited, that single fact defined everything. The conservatory door opened with a creak, and Seraphina swept in, still flushed from the Duke's formal greeting. "Margaret, there you are. I should have known I'd find you playing with dead flowers." Her tone carried that particular blend of affection and dismissal that somehow made the word sting more. "Welcome, cousin," Margaret said, managing a careful smile. Whatever complicated feelings she harbored, she didn't hate Seraphina. It was impossible to hate someone who had never been deliberately cruel, who simply existed in a different reality entirely, one where attention and worth were givens, not wishes. "You must come meet the Duke properly," Seraphina insisted, though her eyes were already drifting back toward the manor. "Uncle Nicholas wants the entire family presented. It will look better if we're all there. Besides, you should see how handsome he is. Those eyes, Margaret, like storm clouds. Though I suppose the scar is rather unfortunate. They say he got it in some dreadful riding accident years ago." "That was thoughtful," Margaret interrupted gently. "But I should finish with the roses. The frost will kill them entirely if I don't." "The roses are already dead," Seraphina said with a dismissive wave. "Come along. You know how Uncle gets when you make him ask twice." Margaret followed her cousin from the conservatory, leaving the shears behind on the bench. The manor's corridors, what had seemed almost peaceful moments ago, now thrummed with barely contained anxiety centered entirely on impressing Duke Gregory Crawford. They passed 3 maids carrying tea services, all of whom curtsied deeply to Seraphina and glanced through Margaret as though she were merely another piece of furniture to be dusted around. She was used to it. The late afternoon found Margaret in the small music room adjacent to the drawing room, ostensibly sorting sheet music, but actually seeking refuge from the performative conversation happening beyond the wall. Her leg ached from standing during the formal introduction, and she retreated the moment Uncle Nicholas's attention had shifted fully to showcasing Seraphina's piano skills. The sound of men's voices filtered through the door, one she recognized, one she didn't. 6 months of courting should be sufficient, Your Grace, Uncle Nicholas was saying, his usually commanding voice edged with something desperate. Perhaps less of the young lady's suit. Seraphina is the jewel of the county, accomplished, beautiful, bred for exactly this position. And the other niece? The Duke's voice was deeper than Margaret had expected, rougher, carrying an edge that suggested he wasn't a man easily managed. A pause. Then, she's a dear girl, but not suitable for consideration. An unfortunate accident in her youth left her with limitations. I keep her comfortable, of course, but she understands her place. No, Your Grace. Seraphina is the daughter you want. The pretty one, as it were. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, the sheet music forgotten in her lap. Each word landing like a physical blow. Not suitable. Limitations. Understands her place. The clinical way her uncle dismissed her existence, as though she were a broken piece of estate property best kept out of sight. "I see," the Duke said, his tone unreadable. "I must be direct, Your Grace," Uncle Nicholas continued, his voice dropping. "The estate is not what it once was. The family requires an advantageous match. Seraphina could be that match. She's been raised specifically to be a duchess. You're in debt." It wasn't a question. Another pause. "Family matters are complicated. Your Grace. Surely a man of your experience understands." I understand perfectly." The Duke's voice had cooled noticeably. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. James, I believe I'll take a turn to the grounds before dinner. Alone." Margaret's hands clench around the sheet music, crumpling the edges. Uncle Nicholas was selling Seraphina to save himself, and Margaret, broken, inconvenient Margaret, was merely an obstacle to be explained away. The music room door opened without warning. Margaret barely had time to look down at her sheet music, feigning absorption, when the Duke himself appeared in the doorway. He stopped, clearly not expecting to find anyone in the room, and for a brief moment their eyes met. His were indeed like storm clouds, gray and turbulent and seeing far too much. The scar Seraphina had mentioned ran from his left temple to his jaw, a pale line that should have been disfiguring, but somehow only made his face more compelling. He looked tired, Margaret thought, tired and haunted, and nothing like the fairy tale princess Seraphina had been dreaming of. "Forgive me," he said, his voice gentler than it had been moments before. "I was looking for the garden exit." "Through the conservatory," Margaret said quietly, pointing. "Down the hall, last door on the right." He nodded but didn't immediately leave. His gaze dropped to her hands, to the crumpled sheet music, then to her face again. "Are you quite all right, miss?" Margaret Elaine. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "And yes, Your Grace." "Perfectly well." The lie hung between them, obvious and fragile. The Duke's expression shifted, not to pity, which he would have hated, but to something that looked oddly like recognition. "The conservatory, you said?" "Yes, Your Grace." He left without another word, but Margaret noticed he didn't close the door entirely behind him. She sat in the music room for a long time after, listening to the distant sounds of Seraphina's practiced laughter, Uncle Nicholas's calculated pleasantries, and beneath it all, the thundering truth of her own invisibility. Evening brought no relief. Dinner was an elaborate performance. 7 courses served in the grand dining room that was far too large for 5 people. The empty chairs seemed to mock them, reminders of the once prosperous family that had filled this house with warmth instead of calculation. Uncle Nicholas dominated the conversation, directing it like a conductor, always circling back to Seraphina's accomplishments, her fluency in French, her watercolors, her skill at managing a household. Each achievement offered up like a jewel for the Duke's inspection. Seraphina played her part perfectly, laughing at precisely the right moments, blushing on cue, her beauty devastating in the candlelight. Margaret ate quietly, spoke only when directly addressed, and excused herself before dessert. No one protested. No one even seemed to notice when she slipped from the room, except, she could have sworn, the Duke's gray eyes following her departure. She found her way back to conservatory, to the stone bench and the dying roses now barely visible in the darkness. Someone had placed a lamp on the windowsill, probably Mrs. Brennan, the only servant who seemed to track Margaret's movements with any care. She didn't reach for the shears. Instead, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the familiar weight of her uncle's words pressing down on her chest. Not suitable. Limitations. The pretty one. Margaret Elaine had spent 23 years as a ghost in someone else's home, drifting through rooms without causing a ripple, existing in the margins of a story that had never been about her. She loved him still, loved her uncle despite his blindness to everything but his own survival, loved Seraphina despite the complicated knot of affection and envy that bound them, but the loneliness of perpetual dismissal had carved a hollow space inside her that no amount of resilience could fill. Footsteps on gravel made her turn. Through the conservatory's glass walls, she could see a figure walking the garden paths, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating their own darkness. The Duke, alone with his thoughts while inside the house. Uncle Nicholas and Seraphina no doubt planned their strategy for tomorrow's continued courtship. Margaret watched him pause beside the frozen fountain, watched him trace the scar on his face absently, and felt an unexpected kinship with this stranger who seemed as trapped as she was, caught in obligations and expectations that had nothing to do with his own desires. He turned suddenly, as though sensing her observation, and their eyes met across the winter garden. The distance was too great for her to read his expression, but he didn't look away. Neither did she. Then he nodded once, a small acknowledgment that she was there, that she existed, that she had been seen. It was such a small gesture, insignificant, really. But as Margaret finally rose from her bench, her legs stiff and aching, she carried that moment with her like a candle flame in the dark. Someone had looked at her, truly looked, and hadn't immediately glanced away to find something more worthy of attention. She moved through the conservatory, extinguishing the lamp, and disappeared into the darkened corridors of the manor, a ghost in borrowed rooms, invisible by design. But perhaps, just perhaps, not quite as invisible as she'd always believed. The morning after the Duke's arrival dawned cold and crystalline, frost clinging to every surface like sugar spun from winter itself. Margaret woke to the sound of her cousin's voice echoing through the corridors, already bright and animated despite the early hour. The performance, it seemed, began at dawn. She dressed herself. No lady's maid was spare for her any more, not when Seraphina required to, and made her way downstairs, keeping to the servants' passages where possible. The main halls were already a flurry of activity. Maids polishing surfaces that had been polished the night before, footmen repositioning furniture to create more flattering angles for Seraphina's inevitable encounters with the Duke. Margaret slipped into the breakfast room, hoping to take her tea quickly and escape before the others descended. But the Duke was already there, standing by the window with a cup in hand, studying the frozen gardens with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something beyond the landscape. She hesitated in the doorway, her instinct to retreat warring with the simple fact that she was hungry and he had already noticed her presence. Miss Margaret. He turned, and she caught the briefest flash of relief in his expression, as though her arrival had saved him from something tedious. Please, don't let me drive you away. The room is large enough for two people seeking quiet. There was a gentle irony in his tone that made her lips twitch despite herself. She moved to the sideboard, acutely aware of her uneven gait, and selected a piece of toast she didn't particularly want. "You're an early riser, Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice neutral and polite, the voice of someone who understood she was meant to be forgettable. "I don't sleep well in unfamiliar houses." He returned to the window, giving her space, which she appreciated more than he could know. "Or perhaps I sleep poorly in general these days. Tell me, are those roses in the conservatory your project?" The question surprised her enough that she looked up from her toast. "Yes, they were my mother's favorites. Everyone else considers them a lost cause. And you don't. I think." Margaret chose her words carefully. "I think declaring something beyond saving is often more about our own limitations than the thing itself." The Duke made a sound that might have been agreement. Before he could respond, the breakfast room doors burst open and Seraphina swept in like sunrise made flesh, all golden curls and rose-colored silk, her smile perfectly calibrated to delight. "Your Grace, how wonderful to find you already awake. I do so admire a man who appreciates the morning hours." She moved past Margaret without acknowledgement, positioning herself near the Duke with the precision of a chess player claiming the advantageous square. "I thought perhaps you might enjoy a tour of the estate grounds. The frost has made everything quite magical, and I know all the best vantage points." Uncle Nicholas appeared in the doorway, his presence adding weight to the invitation. Yes, excellent idea, Seraphina. Your Grace, my niece is a poet's eye for landscape. She'll show you perspectives you'd never discover alone." Margaret watched the familiar choreography unfold, her cousin's practice animation, her uncle's strategic positioning, both of them working in concert to create an irresistible tableau of beauty and charm. Seraphina laughed at something the Duke said, the sound like bells chiming, her hand resting lightly on his arm with carefully rehearsed spontaneity. This was what Seraphina had been trained for since birth. To be the bright center of attention, to make powerful men feel clever and desired, to sell herself with such grace that it never felt like a transaction. And she was magnificent at it. Margaret set down her untouched toast and rose quietly, intending to slip away unnoticed as she always did. But as she reached the doorway, the Duke's voice stopped her. "Miss Margaret, I don't suppose you'd join us?" His gray eyes held hers with a directness that made her pulse quicken. "If your leg permits, that is, I'd value a guide who knows the gardens intimately." The room fell silent. Seraphina's smile froze in place. Uncle Nicholas's expression darkened with barely concealed displeasure, and Margaret stood caught between the safety of refusal and the dangerous temptation of being seen. She felt the weight of her uncle's glare, her cousin's confusion, the Duke's patient waiting. "That's kind, Your Grace, but I'm certain Seraphina will provide far better company." She left before anyone could respond, her heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to regret. Chapter 3. Margaret escaped to the conservatory the moment she was certain the touring party had departed. Through the frosted glass, she could see them in the distance. Seraphina's rose-colored silk a bright spot against the winter landscape, the Duke's dark form beside her, Uncle Nicholas trailing behind like a watchful chaperone. They looked like figures in a painting, perfectly composed, exactly as they should be. She turned away and reached for her shears, focusing on the roses that needed her attention. The physical work helped quiet the strange restlessness that had taken root in her chest since breakfast. She was being foolish. The Duke had been polite, nothing more. Men like Gregory Crawford didn't truly see women like her. They simply had better manners than most. "You refuse my invitation." Margaret startled, the shears slipping from her grip and clattering against the stone floor. The Duke stood in the conservatory doorway, alone, his greatcoat still fastened against the cold. "Your Grace." She bent awkwardly to retrieve the shears, her cheeks burning. "I thought you were touring the ground with my cousin. We completed the circuit. Miss Seraphina has returned inside to warm herself." He moved further into the conservatory, his boots echoing on the stone. "She suggested I might find you here. I think she was glad to be rid of me. Actually, I'm not very good at the sort of conversation she excels at." Margaret didn't know what to say to that. She turned back to her roses, hyper-aware of his presence behind her, the way the space suddenly felt smaller, warmer. "May I ask you something?" His voice was closer now. "Why do you spend so much time trying to save dying things?" Her hand stilled on the stem she'd been examining. "Because no one else will." That's not really an answer, isn't it? She risked a glance over her shoulder and found him watching her with that unsettling intensity, as though she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Everything in this conservatory has been declared beyond saving. The roses are frost-damaged. The soil is depleted. The whole structure is probably one harsh winter away from collapse. But my mother planted these roses, and I—" She stopped, surprised by her own candor. "I suppose I'm not ready to let them die just because everyone else has given up." The Duke moved to stand beside her, studying the blackened stems and the few stubborn green shoots that refused to surrender. "Your uncle seems to have given up on more than roses." The observation was too accurate, too pointed. Margaret's throat tightened. "My uncle has many concerns. I'm simply not one of them. Because of your leg." The bluntness should have offended her, but there was no pity in his voice, only statement of fact. She found that oddly freeing. Because I'm damaged goods, your grace, not suitable for display or useful for alliance. Just another broken thing taking up space. I see. He was quiet for a moment, then reached up to trace the scar that ran down his face, the gesture so unconscious, she wondered if he even realized he was doing it. I got this in a riding accident 8 years ago. The same accident that killed my wife and unborn child. Margaret's breath caught. She turned fully to face him, the roses momentarily forgotten. For years after, he continued, his voice steady but weighted, people looked at this scar and saw my tragedy. They saw the Duke who lost everything, the man trapped in perpetual mourning. They stopped seeing me, Gregory Crawford, who has thoughts and desires beyond grief. They decided what I could be based on one visible wound. His gray eyes met hers. But you understand that, don't you? What it's like to be reduced to a single flaw. Yes. The word escaped before she could stop it, raw and honest. Your uncle called you broken, the Duke said quietly. At breakfast, he made it abundantly clear that you're not to be considered, that only the pretty one is worth my attention. Shame flooded through her, hot and bitter. Your Grace, He's wrong. Gregory moved closer, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and carefully carried burdens. You're not broken, Miss Margaret. You're just surrounded by people who've forgotten how to see. The conservatory suddenly felt too warm, too small, too full of dangerous possibilities. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Why did you really come here, Your Grace? Her voice emerged barely above a whisper. To this conservatory, I mean... A ghost of a smile touched his scarred face. Because I suspect you're the only honest thing in this entire house. And I'm tired of performances. Outside, Seraphina's laughter drifted through glass, bright and practiced and perfect. Inside, two damaged people stood among dying roses and recognized something true in each other, something that had nothing to do with beauty or wholeness, and everything to do with being seen. Uncle Nicholas announced the dinner party with the triumphant air of a general planning his decisive battle. The Duke would be formally introduced to the county's most influential families, and Seraphina would shine as the undisputed jewel of the evening. Margaret was informed, not invited, informed, that her presence was required for propriety's sake, though she was expected to remain appropriately inconspicuous. She dressed in her oldest acceptable gown, a deep burgundy that had been her mother's, and made her feel slightly less invisible. Mrs. Brennan helped her with the buttons, her weathered hands gentle, her expression troubled. You look lovely, Miss Margaret, the housekeeper said quietly. Don't let them make you feel otherwise. Margaret squeezed her hand in thanks, though they both knew loveliness had never been her currency in this house. The drawing room glittered with candlelight and carefully arranged flowers. Seraphina held cord and amber silk that seemed to capture every flame, her laughter perfectly timed, her movements choreographed to catch the Duke's attention at every turn. Uncle Nicholas worked the room with desperate energy, ensuring every guest understood his niece's exceptional qualities, her impeccable breeding, her suitability for the highest ranks of society. Margaret positioned herself near the window, a glass of untouched wine in her hand, performing her expected role as background decoration. She watched the Duke navigate the social theater with polite detachment, his responses courteous but guarded, his gaze occasionally drifting, she couldn't help but notice, in her direction. When dinner was announced, Uncle Nicholas had orchestrated the seating with military precision, the Duke at the head of the table, Seraphina to his right in the place of honor, himself directly across to maintain control of the conversation. Margaret found herself relegated to the far end, wedged between the elderly Sir Morrison, who was half-deaf, and Mrs. Blackwell, who never spoke to anyone beneath her social standing. The first courses passed in a blur of forced gaiety and calculated charm. Seraphina was radiant, her stories polished to perfection, her wit sharp enough to delight but never threaten. Uncle Nicholas steered every topic back to his daughter's accomplishments with the subtlety of a man drowning and grasping for driftwood. Margaret ate mechanically, responded when spoken to, and tried not to notice how the Duke's expression had grown increasingly shuttered as the evening progressed, as though he were watching a play he'd seen too many times before. It was during the fourth course that disaster struck. A servant needed to pass behind Margaret's chair, and in her attempt to accommodate him, she rose slightly, too quickly, without thinking. Her weakened leg betrayed her. She stumbled, catching herself on the table's edge, but not before her wine glass toppled, sending dark red liquid spreading across the white linen like blood. The conversation died instantly. Every eye turned to her. Margaret's face burned with mortification as she tried to right the glass with trembling hands. Margaret. Uncle Nicholas's voice cracked like a whip across the sudden silence. For God's sake, can you not manage even the simplest? He stopped himself, visibly struggling for control, but his face had already betrayed his fury and his shame. Perhaps it would be best if you retired. You're clearly not well. The words hung in the air, laden with dismissal and disgust. Margaret felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller, wishing she could disappear entirely. This was what she was to him. An embarrassment, a liability, a broken thing that couldn't even sit at a table without causing disruption. Mr. James. The Duke's voice cut through the tension like a blade, cold and absolutely final. He had risen from his seat, every inch of him radiating controlled anger. If Miss Margaret is unwell, then so am I. I find myself quite fatigued from the evening's entertainments. Uncle Nicholas paled. Your Grace, surely there's no need. I insist. Gregory moved down the table with deliberate purpose until he stood beside Margaret's chair. He offered her his arm, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Miss Margaret, would you do me the honor of taking some air in the conservatory? I find I'm in desperate need of honest conversation. She stared at him, unable to process what was happening. Around them, the dinner guests watched in stunned silence. Seraphina's perfect smile had frozen into something brittle. Uncle Nicholas looked as though he might have an apoplexy. Your Grace, she managed, her voice barely steady. You don't have to. I know. His hand covered hers where it rested on the table, warm and solid and real. But I want to, unless you prefer to remain. Margaret looked at her uncle's furious face, at Seraphina's confusion, at the gathered guests who had witnessed her humiliation. Then she looked at the Duke's outstretched arm, at the quiet defiance in his scarred features, at the choice he was offering her. She took his arm. The conservatory was blessedly dark and cool after the suffocating heat of the dining room. Gregory led her to her usual bench, then took a position standing nearby, giving her space while remaining protectively close. I'm sorry, Margaret said finally, her voice thick with unshed tears. You shouldn't have done that. Uncle Nicholas will be furious, and Seraphina can manage one evening without being the center of attention. Gregory finished quietly. As can your uncle manage one evening without selling his daughter like prize livestock? He turned to face her fully. Margaret, may I call you Margaret? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Margaret, I've spent the past 3 days watching your family treat you like you're invisible, like you're somehow less valuable because you limp, and tonight, watching him try to shame you for a simple accident. His jaw tightened. I won't be party to that. I won't sit silently while someone diminishes you. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why do you care? Because, he said simply, you're the only person in this entire charade who hasn't lied to me once. Margaret spent the following morning in the library. her sanctuary within a house that had never truly felt like home. She'd risen before dawn, unable to sleep after the disaster of the dinner party, and sought refuge among the books that had always been more reliable companions than people. The leather chair by the eastern window embraced her like an old friend as she tried, and failed, to focus on philosophy text open in her lap. The door opened without warning. She looked up, expecting Mrs. Brennan, and found the Duke instead. He stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested he'd been searching for her specifically. His cravat was slightly loosened, his dark hair disheveled as though he'd been running his hands through it. A glimpse of the man beneath the title that made him seem suddenly, dangerously human. "I hoped I'd find you here," he said, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that felt significant in ways Margaret couldn't quite name. "Your Grace, if my uncle discovers you've sought me out alone. Your uncle is currently occupied with damage control in the village, explaining to half the county why I abandoned his daughter at dinner." Gregory moved into the library with the casual confidence of someone who'd stopped caring about propriety somewhere between the wine spill and sunrise. "I suspect we have at least an hour before he returns to lecture me about appropriate behavior." Despite herself, Margaret felt her lips twitch. "You've made things very difficult for him." "Good." He settled into the chair across from hers, studying her with that unsettling directness. "Margaret, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." Her heart began to pound. "Your Grace." "Gregory. When we're alone, please call me Gregory." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gray eyes holding hers. "I didn't come to this estate by accident. I came specifically because of you." The words made no sense. Margaret shook her head slowly. "That's impossible. Uncle Nicholas invited you for Seraphina. He's been planning." "Your uncle invited me, yes. But I accepted because 6 months ago, at a dinner party in London, I overheard a conversation between two gentlemen who'd recently visited this estate. They were laughing about Nicholas James's predicament, a man desperate to marry off his beautiful daughter to save his failing finances, while hiding away his other niece who had the audacity to be both damaged and sharp-tongued. Margaret's breath caught. She remembered that visit, remembered the two pompous lords who'd looked through her at dinner, and then spent the evening in her uncle's study drinking expensive brandy they couldn't afford. One of them, Gregory continued, told a story about how you corrected his Latin translation at tea, said you'd done it so politely that he didn't realize he'd been insulted until an hour later. The other laughed and said it was a shame about your leg, because your wit was rather too keen for a woman who should be grateful for any attention at all. The memory surfaced sharp and bitter. Lord Pemberton's condescending attempt to impress everyone with his classical education, his smug face when she gently offered the correct translation, his barely concealed contempt when she'd excuse herself from the room. "I went home that night," Gregory said quietly, "and I couldn't stop thinking about a woman clever enough to humble a pompous lord and brave enough to do it while knowing she'd be punished for it. About someone who existed in the margins but refused to make herself small intellectually, even when the world demanded it." He paused. "So I made inquiries, learned about your mother's death, your accident, the way your uncle relegated you to the shadows while polishing your cousin like a prize to be sold. And I thought, here is someone who understands what it means to be seen only for your scars." Margaret's hands trembled where they gripped the book. "You came here for me?" "I came here because I was curious about the woman everyone dismissed. Because I wanted to meet someone who tended dying roses and read philosophy in corners and spoke truth even when silence would have been safer." Gregory's expression softened. "And then I arrived and found you were everything I'd hoped and more. Someone real in a house full of performance. Someone who sees me as Gregory, not the tragic duke or the convenient solution to financial problems. But Seraphina, is lovely and accomplished, and exactly what everyone expects me to want. He stood, moving to the window, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. Do you know how exhausting it is, Margaret, being presented with perfection, with women who've been trained since birth to be flawless companions, who say only what I want to hear and perform charm like it's a competitive sport? Your cousin is beautiful, yes, but I can't have a genuine conversation with her. She's too busy trying to be whatever she thinks I need. And I'm not. Margaret heard the bitterness in her own voice. I'm just a broken one who has nothing to lose, so I might as well be honest. No. He turned back to her, and the intensity in his eyes made her pulse race. You're the brave one who chooses honesty even when you have everything to lose. You're the strong one who survives in a house that treats you like you're worthless and still manages to be kind. You're the brilliant one who reads philosophy and tends roses and corrects Latin translations because your mind refuses to be diminished even when your body has been judged inadequate. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning Margaret wasn't sure she could trust. Her throat felt tight, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Gregory crossed a space between them, kneeling beside her chair, so they were eye to eye. Because I'm tired of pretending, Margaret. Because in 3 days you've given me more genuine conversation than I've had in 8 years. Because when I look at you, I don't see someone broken. I see someone extraordinary trying to bloom in soil that was never meant to sustain her. His hand found hers, warm and steady. And because I think you deserve to know that you're not invisible. Not to me. Outside the library, footsteps echoed in the corridor. They both heard it. Uncle Nicholas's voice, sharp with agitation, coming closer. Gregory squeezed her hand once before standing, putting a respectable distance between them just as the door flew open. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. Margaret's heart had already begun to believe in impossible things. Uncle Nicholas waited until the Duke had departed for his afternoon ride before summoning Margaret to his study. She knew the moment Mrs. Brennan delivered the message, her face tight with worry, that this confrontation had been building since the dinner party. Perhaps since the moment Gregory had first looked at her instead of through her. The study smelled of old leather and older desperation. Uncle Nicholas stood behind his massive desk, his hands braced against the wood, his face mottled with barely controlled rage. He didn't invite her to sit. Do you have any idea what you've done? His voice was low, dangerous in its restraint. Any comprehension of the damage you've caused? Margaret stood as straight as her leg would allow, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from trembling. Uncle, I haven't. Don't. The word cracked like a gunshot. Don't stand there and claim innocence. The Duke abandoned the dinner party, abandoned my daughter, to escort you to the conservatory. He spent more time in your company these past days than in Seraphina's. He seeks you out in the library, alone. Do you understand what people will say? What they already are saying. I didn't ask for his attention. No, you simply accepted it. Uncle Nicholas moved around the desk, each step measured, predatory. You, who should be grateful for the roof over your head and the scraps from our table. You, who contribute nothing to this household except obligation and expense. And now you dare to interfere with the one opportunity, the only opportunity we have to salvage this family from complete ruin. The words landed like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the vulnerable places Margaret had spent years trying to protect. She felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller, the way she always did under his contempt. Seraphina has been trained since birth for this, he continued, his voice rising. Every accomplishment, every lesson, every moment of her life has been preparation for securing exactly this kind of match. The Duke is our salvation, Margaret. His fortune could restore everything we've lost, secure our place in society, ensure our survival. And you with your limp and your books and your ridiculous roses, you're destroying it all. I haven't done anything wrong. Margaret's voice emerged smaller than she intended, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. The Duke has shown me kindness, nothing more. Kindness. Uncle Nicholas laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. Men like the Duke don't show kindness to women like you without expecting something in return. He's amusing himself with you, Margaret, playing at charity with a broken niece, while he makes his real decision about Seraphina. And when he's done with his little game, when he's satisfied his curiosity about the damaged oddity, he'll choose the pretty one, as he always intended to. The cruelty of it stole her breath. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together against the onslaught. But by then, her uncle pressed on relentlessly. The damage will be done. Society will have watched him pay attention to you. They'll wonder why. They'll gossip. And Seraphina, beautiful, perfect Seraphina, will be tainted by association with a niece the Duke found more interesting. Do you see? Your very existence is poison to her prospects. Uncle Nicholas, please. Here is what will happen. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath. See the desperation in his bloodshot eyes. You will avoid the Duke entirely. If he seeks you out, you will plead illness. If he asks for you, you will be unavailable. You will make yourself invisible. Truly invisible, until he makes the proper choice and proposes to Seraphina. His voice dropped to something darker, more threatening. And if you don't, if you continue this selfish interference, I will cast you out. Not to some comfortable cottage in the country, Margaret. I'll turn you out without reference, without funds, without anything. You'll find yourself on the streets within a week. Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the back of the nearest chair for support. You wouldn't I? His smile was cruel. I'm already drowning, niece. What's one more stone in my pockets? At least with you gone, Seraphina's path would be clear. At least then I'd only have one mouth to feed and one future secure. He straightened his waistcoat, his expression settling into cold finality. Your mother left you nothing. I made certain of that when I was appointed your guardian. Every penny you might have inherited went to estate management. You have no funds, no connections beyond this household, no skills that would earn you respectable employment. Without my protection, you are nothing. Remember that. The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and absolute. Margaret understood with terrible clarity that he meant every word. Uncle Nicholas was a desperate man, and desperate men were capable of cruelty she'd only glimpsed until now. Do we have an understanding? He asked. His voice returned to something almost conversational, as though they'd been discussing nothing more consequential than dinner arrangements. Margaret's throat felt tight, her eyes burning. She thought of Gregory's words in the library, of the way he'd looked at her like she mattered, like she was extraordinary rather than broken. She thought of the impossible hope that had begun to take root in her chest. Foolish, dangerous hope. And then she thought of the alternative, of being cast out with nothing, of having nowhere to go and no one who would take her in, of dying slowly in some workhouse or worse, on the streets of a city that had no mercy for women without protection. Yes, she whispered, the word tasting like ash. I understand. Good. Uncle Nicholas returned to his desk, already dismissing her from his attention. Now get out. And Margaret? He looked up, his eyes cold. If the Duke asks why you're avoiding him, you'll tell him you reconsidered the appropriateness of your acquaintance. You'll make it clear that you understand your place. Is that clear? Yes, Uncle. She left the study on trembling legs, her vision blurred with tears. She refused to let fall until she reached the safety of her small room. There, finally alone, Margaret collapsed onto her narrow bed and wept for the future she'd been foolish enough to imagine. The one where someone like Gregory Crawford could truly see her, could truly want her, could somehow make her believe she deserved more than the shadows. But Uncle Nicholas was right about one thing. She was nothing without his protection, and nothing had no power to choose its own fate. The masquerade ball arrived like a glittering trap. Uncle Nicholas had commissioned masks for both his nieces, though Margaret's, a simple bronze affair that covered only her eyes, seemed designed more for obligation than beauty. Seraphina's was an elaborate confection of gold and peacock feathers that transformed her into something mythical, a goddess descended to walk among mortals. Margaret had avoided Gregory for 3 days since her uncle's ultimatum, pleading headaches and fatigue through Mrs. Brennan whenever he inquired. Each refusal felt like tearing something vital from her chest, but the alternative, being cast out with nothing, was a terror she couldn't face. She'd watch from her window as he groaned increasingly frustrated, his daily rides growing longer, his expression more shuttered. Now, standing in the ballroom of Lord Ashford's estate, surrounded by masked strangers and flickering candlelight, Margaret felt the full weight of her performance. She would attend, as required for propriety. She would remain invisible, as demanded by her uncle, and she would watch Gregory dance with Seraphina and accept that hope had always been a luxury beyond her means. The music swirled through the room, couples moving in elaborate patterns while Margaret positioned herself behind a marble column, half hidden by shadows and potted palms. She could see Uncle Nicholas working the crowd with renewed vigor, Seraphina at his side, both of them radiating confidence now that the broken niece had been properly contained. Hiding doesn't suit you. Margaret's heart stopped. She turned to find a tall figure in a simple black mask standing closer than propriety allowed. She knew him instantly. The breadth of his shoulders, the way he held himself, the scar visible even beneath the mask's edge. Your Grace, you shouldn't. Gregory. His voice was low, edged with something that sounded like pain. And you've been avoiding me for 3 days. I want to know why. Margaret forced herself to look away, to focus on the dancers spinning past. I've been unwell. That's a lie. He moved closer, and she could feel the warmth of him, the magnetic pull she'd been fighting since that first conversation in the conservatory. Margaret, what happened? After the library, after everything we discussed, you disappeared. You won't see me, won't speak to me, if I've done something to offend. You haven't. The words escaped before she could stop them. You've been nothing but kind. Too kind. Too kind. There was an edge of frustration in his voice now. What does that mean? She turned to face him fully, her hands clenched at her sides. This was her chance, her only chance, to push him away before her uncle made good on his threat, before she destroyed whatever future Seraphina might have, before she allowed herself to believe in impossibilities that would only bring more pain. It means, Your Grace, that I've reconsidered the appropriateness of our acquaintance. The practiced words felt like glass in her throat. I understand my place now. I should never have encouraged your attention. It was presumptuous of me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things she couldn't say. When Gregory spoke again, his voice had gone dangerously quiet. Presumptuous. That's an interesting word choice. He tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her want to flee. Tell me, Margaret, and I know it's you, no mask could hide that particular blend of intelligence and stubbornness in your eyes. Did your uncle threaten you? Her sharp intake of breath betrayed her before she could manufacture denial. I see. Gregory's jaw tightened beneath the mask. What did he say? That he cast you out? Ruin you? Both. It doesn't matter. Margaret's voice cracked despite her best efforts. He's right. I'm interfering with something important, something that could save my family. Seraphina deserves. Don't. The single word cut through her explanation like a blade. Don't you dare tell me what Seraphina deserves while you're standing here trying to sacrifice yourself on the altar of your uncle's greed. It's not like that, isn't it? He moved closer still, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You're intelligent enough to see what's happening here, Margaret. Your uncle is selling your cousin to the highest bidder to save himself from ruin, and he's using you, threatening you, to ensure the transaction goes smoothly. That's not family loyalty. That's cruelty. Tears burned behind her mask. What else can I do? I have nothing, Gregory. No money, no prospects, nowhere to go if he turns me out. I'm already a burden. At least this way I'm useful. At least Seraphina gets the life she's been promised. And what about the life you deserve? The question hung between them, impossibly tender. Margaret shook her head, unable to answer, unable to even imagine such a thing. I know your voice, Gregory said quietly, his hand reaching up to gently touch her masked face. I know the way you tilt your head when you're trying not to cry. I know the stubborn set of your shoulders when you're being brave about something that's breaking your heart. No mask could hide you from me, Margaret. Not this one. Not any other lie you try to tell. Please don't make this harder. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper. Just dance with Seraphina. Marry her if that's what you need to do. Forget about the broken girl who dared to hope for something impossible. No, the word was absolute, final. I won't forget you. I won't pretend these past days didn't happen. And I certainly won't marry your cousin to satisfy your uncle's machinations. His thumb traced the edge of her mask with devastating gentleness. You think you're saving me from your ruined reputation? Margaret, my reputation was ruined 8 years ago when half of society decided I was either a tragic figure to pity or damaged goods to avoid. I don't need saving. I need honesty. I need someone who sees me as a man, not a title or a tragedy. I need you. You can't. But even as she said it, her resolve was crumbling, her carefully constructed walls falling like sand before tide. Watch me. Gregory glanced over his shoulder toward where Uncle Nicholas stood watching them, his expression murderous even from across the ballroom. Your uncle wants to control you through fear. He wants you to believe you're worthless without his protection. But here's what he doesn't understand, Margaret. I'm a duke. I have power he can only dream of. And I'm not afraid of desperate men. What are you saying? His eyes found hers again, storm gray and unwavering. I'm saying fight, Margaret. Stop hiding behind masks and practice words. Stop letting him make you small. Stand with me. And I swear on everything I have that he will never cast you out, never threaten you, never make you feel invisible again. The music swelled around them. Through the crowd, Margaret could see her uncle pushing through the dancers toward them. Seraphina trailing behind, looking confused and hurt. The moment was collapsing, the careful performance unraveling. Everything about come crashing down. Gregory extended his hand. Dance with me. Here, now, in front of everyone. Let them see that the Duke chooses a woman in the bronze mask, the one with the limp and the sharp mind and the brave heart. Let your uncle see that his threats mean nothing. Margaret stared at his outstretched hand, at the choice he was offering her. Safety in shadows or risk in the light. Survival or the chance at something more. She took his hand. The morning after the masquerade brought Uncle Nicholas's final, desperate gambit. Margaret was summoned to the drawing room where she found not just her uncle, but Seraphina, Mrs. Brennan looking distressed in the corner, and Gregory standing by the window with an expression of controlled fury that made her blood run cold. On the table between them lay a letter, the paper expensive, the handwriting unmistakably hers. Perhaps, Your Grace, You'd like Miss Margaret to explain this correspondence we discovered this morning." Uncle Nicholas's voice dripped with manufactured sorrow, the performance of a man wounded by betrayal. "Go ahead, niece. Tell the Duke what you wrote." Margaret moved closer, her leg aching from a sleepless night, and looked down at the letter. Her breath caught. The words were hers. She recognized phrases from her personal journal, sentences from letters she'd written to her mother's memory and never sent. But they'd been carefully arranged, stitched together like a grotesque patchwork, to create something she'd never intended. "Your Grace," the letter read in her handwriting, "I confess my deception weighs heavily. My attentions have been calculated from the start. A duke's fortune could secure my future far better than remaining a burden to my uncle's charity. Seraphina deserves better than a sister who would steal her suitor through manipulation and false intimacy. I have played upon your sympathy for damaged things, knowing a man of your reputation might mistake pity for something deeper. Forgive my mercenary heart." The room spun. Margaret gripped the table's edge, her mind racing to understand how her uncle had managed this. Then she remembered. The letters she'd stored in her mother's writing desk, the journal she kept locked in her room. Uncle Nicholas must have taken them, cut them apart, reassembled them into this poison. "Is this your handwriting, Miss Margaret?" Gregory's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the tension beneath it, the question of whether she'd lied to him from the beginning. "The handwriting is mine," she whispered. "But the letter, I never wrote this. I never." "She's lying, of course." Uncle Nicholas moved to stand beside Seraphina, one hand on his daughter's shoulder in a tableau of wounded virtue. "Your Grace, I apologize for my niece's scheming. I had hoped her behavior at the masquerade was simply poor judgment, but this letter proves a darker design. She saw an opportunity in your kindness and exploited it, knowing that a man of your sensibilities might be moved by her circumstances." "That's not true." The words burst from Margaret with a force that surprised even her. "Uncle Nicholas, how dare you? How dare I?" He turned on her with practiced outrage. "How dare you, Margaret? After everything we've done for you, after providing you a home when no one else would take you, after tolerating your presence despite the burden, the expense, the constant reminder of your mother's poor judgment in marrying beneath herself. And this is how you repay us? By trying to steal your cousin's one chance at the life she deserves." Seraphina stood silent, her face pale, her eyes darting between Margaret and the Duke with an expression that might have been guilt or confusion or both. "Your Grace," Uncle Nicholas continued, his voice softening into something meant to sound paternal, "I beg your understanding. Margaret has always been troubled. The accident that damaged her leg also affected her judgment. I fear she becomes attached to things beyond her reach. Dead roses, impossible futures. I should have been more vigilant. That's enough." Gregory's voice cut through the speech like winter frost. He hadn't moved from the window, but something in his posture had shifted, coiled tight like a predator preparing to strike. "Mr. James, I've listened to your performance with remarkable patience. Now let me tell you what I know." Uncle Nicholas's expression flickered, just for a moment, with uncertainty. "I know," Gregory continued, moving away from the window with deliberate slowness, "that you've been borrowing against this estate for 5 years. I know your creditors are circling like wolves. I know you need Seraphina to marry well not just for comfort, but for survival." He picked up the letter, studying it with cool detachment. "And I know that desperate men forge documents when their plans begin to crumble. Your Grace, I assure you, I'm not finished." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried absolute authority. "I also know that Margaret keeps a journal. I know because she told me about it, about how she writes letters to her dead mother, because there's no one else in this house who listens to her. about how she stores them in her mother's writing desk that you, as her guardian, have access to. He held up the letter. This is clever work, I'll grant you, taking genuine phrases from private correspondence and arranging them into something incriminating. But you made mistakes. Gregory moved to stand directly before Margaret, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to both flee and lean closer. Margaret, he said gently, tell me the truth, all of it, not what your uncle wants me to hear, not what you think will protect your family. The truth about your accident, about your life here, about what you want. I'm asking you to trust me. The room fell silent. Margaret could feel her uncle's rage radiating from across the space, could see Seraphina's stricken expression, could sense Mrs. Brennan's quiet support. But all of it faded beneath the weight of Gregory's patient waiting, his willingness to hear her, truly hear her, despite the damning evidence and her uncle's manipulations. I was 12, Margaret began, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word, when the accident happened. I was riding my mother's horse, the one Uncle Nicholas said was too spirited for a girl. I fell. The horse panicked and kicked my leg before anyone could stop it. The doctor said I'd never walk again, but I did. Not perfectly, but I did. She forced herself to meet Gregory's eyes, to let him see everything. My mother died 6 months later. Grief, they said, though I think it was more that she couldn't bear to see me damaged, to know that her daughter would never have the life she dreamed for me. Uncle Nicholas became my guardian. He took what little my mother left me and used it to pay his debts. And I let him, because where else could I go? Who else would take a broken girl with no fortune and no prospects? Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. I didn't try to seduce you, Gregory. I didn't scheme or manipulate. I just existed, and for the first time in my life, someone looked at me and saw something other than damage or obligation or burden. You saw me, and yes, I wanted that. I wanted it so desperately it terrified me. But I never wrote that letter. I would never. The tears came now hot and unstoppable. I expected nothing from you. How could I? I'm exactly what my uncle says. Broken, unmarriageable, worth less than the roses I try to save. If you believed his lies, I wouldn't blame you. Everyone always does. Gregory crossed the space between them in 3 strides and took Margaret's hand in his, heedless of propriety, heedless of Uncle Nicholas's strangled protest, heedless of everything except a woman trembling before him with tears streaming down her face. You are not broken, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Do you hear me, Margaret? You are not broken, not damaged, not less than. You survived an accident that should have destroyed you. You survived losing your mother and your inheritance and years of being told you were worthless. You survived in a house that treated you like a ghost and still managed to be kind, to be brilliant, to tend dying roses because you couldn't bear to let another living thing be abandoned. His thumbs brushed across her knuckles, gentle and grounding. If that's what you call broken, then give me broken over perfection every single day. Your Grace, this is highly irregular, Uncle Nicholas began, his voice rising with panic. Be quiet. Gregory didn't even look at him. His entire focus remained on Margaret, on the woman who'd carved a space in his carefully guarded heart, without even trying. Margaret Elaine, I came to this estate looking for you. Not the pretty one, not the accomplished one, not the daughter who'd been polished and prepared for auction. I came looking for the woman who was brave enough to correct a lord's Latin, who was stubborn enough to save roses everyone else had given up on, who was real in a world that values performance over truth. Gregory, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. He released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb catching the tears still falling. These past weeks with you have been the first time since my wife died that I felt alive instead of just existing. You don't look at me and see the tragic duke or the scarred widower or the fortune that could save your family. You see Gregory. Just Gregory. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? Margaret shook her head wordlessly, unable to process what was happening, afraid to hope after so many years of learning that hope was dangerous. I'm going to ask you a question, Gregory said quietly, and I need you to answer honestly, not with what you think I want to hear or what your uncle demands or what society expects. Can you do that? She nodded, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. Do you want me, Margaret? Not my title, not my fortune, not as an escape from this house. Me, the man who sleeps poorly and carries his own scars and probably drinks too much brandy when his ghosts get loud. The man who wants to spend his evenings debating philosophy in conservatories and his mornings watching you tend roses. Do you want that? Do you want me? The question hung in the air, fragile and enormous. Margaret looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw everything she'd been afraid to name, longing and vulnerability and something that looked dangerously like love. Behind them, she could hear her uncle's labored breathing, Seraphina's muffled sob, the ticking of the mantel clock marking the seconds of her choice. Yes, she whispered, then stronger. Yes, I want you. I wanted you since that first morning in the conservatory, when you didn't look away from me, when you saw me limping and damaged and still chose to stay. Gregory's answering smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of grief and loneliness in a single moment of pure joy. He dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hand, while gasps echoed through the drawing room. Then marry me, Margaret, not because I pity you or because I'm rescuing you or because your family needs saving. Marry me because in a world full of masks and performances, you're the only person who's real. Because your sharp tongue makes me laugh and your stubborn hope makes me brave, and your presence makes me want to be the man I was before grief tried to bury me. His voice softened, intimate despite their audience. Marry me because you're not broken. You're whole in all the ways that matter. And I want to spend whatever years I have left learning every corner of that wholeness. Your grace, this is madness. Uncle Nicholas finally found his voice, stepping forward with desperation etched into every line of his face. Margaret has nothing to offer you. No fortune, no connections, no. She is everything I need. Gregory's voice went cold as winter frost, though he didn't look away from Margaret. And you, Mr. James, have nothing I want. Not your debts, not your schemes, and certainly not your pretty daughter who deserves far better than to be sold like livestock to save your failing estate. Seraphina made a small sound of distress. For the first time, Margaret looked at her cousin and saw not a rival, but another woman trapped by their uncle's desperation, another piece in a game neither of them had chosen to play. Seraphina, Gregory said, finally turning his head to address her directly. You are lovely and accomplished, and I mean no insult when I say you deserve a man who wants you for yourself, not as a financial transaction. I hope you find him. Then he returned his full attention to Margaret, to the woman still standing frozen with tears on her cheeks and disbelief in her hazel eyes. Margaret Elaine, I'm still on my knee, and my leg is starting to cramp, so I'll ask again, will you marry me? Will you let me give you the life you deserve? The one where you're seen and valued and loved exactly as you are. The word love hung between them, spoken so casually but meaning everything. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. All the years of being invisible, of being tolerated rather than wanted, of believing she was too damaged to deserve happiness. It all shattered beneath the weight of this impossible, wonderful man offering her not just escape, but genuine partnership. Yes. The word came out steady and sure. Yes, Gregory, I'll marry you. He stood, pulling her into his arms with a relief so profound she could feel in the way he held her, like something precious he'd been searching for and finally found. The drawing room erupted in chaos behind them. Uncle Nicholas sputtering protests about propriety and family honor, and the scandal this would cause. Seraphina crying into Mrs. Brennan's shoulder, though whether from relief or disappointment Margaret couldn't tell. The housekeeper herself looking vindicated, as though she'd known all along how this story would end. But Margaret heard none of it. She was too busy learning the feeling of being held by someone who chose her, who wanted her, who saw past her limp and her lack of fortune, and her years of invisibility to the person beneath. "We'll leave today," Gregory murmured against her hair. "I'll have my solicitor handle the legal matters, ensuring your uncle can never touch you again, settling whatever debts need settling so Seraphina isn't left destitute. But you, Margaret, you're coming home with me, to a house with a proper conservatory, where you can save as many roses as you want, to a library 3 times the size of this one, to a life where you never have to hide or make yourself small or accept being treated as less than." Margaret pulled back just enough to see his face, to confirm this was real and not some fevered dream born of desperation. "What if I disappoint you? What if the reality of being married to someone who limps and reads too much philosophy and argues about everything is less appealing than the idea? Then I'll consider myself the luckiest man alive." Gregory smiled, that rare full smile that made him look younger, lighter, free. "Margaret, I don't want easy. I don't want perfect. I want real. I want you, exactly as you are, sharp-tongued and stubborn and brave enough to bloom in darkness. That's not settling. That's choosing the only person who makes me feel whole." Behind them, Uncle Nicholas was still protesting, his voice growing shrill with the realization that his final play had failed, that the broken niece he dismissed and threatened had somehow won everything. But his words no longer had power. His threats meant nothing against the Duke's protection and a man's genuine devotion. Margaret stood in the drawing room where she'd spent years being invisible, held by someone who'd crossed half of England just to find her, and finally, allowed herself to believe in impossible things. She was seen. She was wanted. She was enough. And the roses, she thought with a smile breaking through her tears, would be beautiful this spring. Margaret spent years believing she was broken and unworthy of love because of her physical limitation and her family's treatment. Gregory saw past her limp to recognize her intelligence, resilience, and authenticity as her greatest strengths. Have you ever felt invisible or diminished because of something about yourself that others deemed imperfect? What would it take for you to see that perceived flaw as Gregory saw Margaret's, not as damage, but as part of what makes you authentically whole?
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to support the channel. I've got another great story lined up for you. Click the video on your screen now to watch it next. See you there.